had 3 minutes before the prison transport van pulled away and 15 years disappeared behind steel and concrete. My hands didn't shake as I adjusted my tie one last time. The fabric felt foreign now. Expensive silk against calloused fingers that would soon know only rough cotton and cold metal. Around me, the courtroom emptied with the muted shuffle of expensive shoes on marble. Lawyers closing briefcases, journalists whispering into phones, the prosecutor laughing quietly with someone about dinner plans. Outside, reporters pressed against the courthouse windows like vultures. But in here, everything was silent, too silent, suffocating. I walked toward the exit like a king heading to his own execution. Behind me, Tiana sat in the gallery's third row, her black dress pristine, her face a carefully composed mask of grief. She looked like a grieving wife. She wasn't. Her tears caught the harsh courtroom lights, rolling down her cheeks in perfect cinematic arcs. Those tears had convinced the jury. They'd convinced the judge. They'd convinced everyone. Everyone except the man she'd destroyed. Kang Min-jae. That's what the sentencing papers said. 15 years for racketeering, money laundering, conspiracy to commit murder. My empire, my freedom, my life, reduced to case number 2024, CR 8847. The judge's gavel still echoed in my skull. That final crack of wood on wood that sounded like a coffin lid slamming shut. The courtroom had been full. Standing room only. Everyone wanted to see the fall of the untouchable Korean Mafia boss who'd controlled the East Side for 12 years. They got their show. What they didn't know was that the star witnesses, my own people, had rehearsed their lines. Shin Soo-min, my lieutenant for 8 years, the man I'd pulled from the streets and made wealthy, had sat in that witness box with his slicked back hair and tailored suit. His testimony was surgical. Dates, locations, transactions. All true, all carefully selected, all missing the context that would have revealed who actually gave the orders that sent those shipments across state lines. Sebastian Knox, my second in command, the strategist I'd trusted with my operation's most sensitive information, had provided the prosecution with evidence. Financial records, encrypted communications, surveillance photos, a paper trail that led straight to me. What the prosecutor didn't mention was that Sebastian had created half those records in the 3 months before my arrest. And Tiana, my wife of 5 years, sat 3 rows back, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief that probably cost more than most people's weekly groceries. When the prosecutor asked if she feared for her safety, her voice had cracked perfectly. Every day, she'd whispered, every single day, the jury had eaten it alive. 2 hours ago, I'd watched her testify about the evidence she'd discovered. Bank statements hidden in my office. Threatening phone calls she'd accidentally overheard. Her fear, her isolation, her desperate attempts to protect me from myself. It was a masterpiece of performance. I'd have applauded if my hands hadn't been cuffed. The bailiff's hand on my shoulder pulled me back to the present. Time to go, Min-jae. Not Mr. Kong anymore, just Min-jae. They'd started stripping away my identity before I'd even left the courtroom. I didn't look back as they led me toward the prisoner exit. Not at the judge who'd believed the lies. Not at the prosecutor who'd built his career on my manufactured guilt. And definitely not at Tiana, still crying her perfect tears in the gallery. Because I'd seen her 2 nights before my arrest. The surveillance system in my penthouse had 17 cameras. Tiana knew about 12 of them. She didn't know about the 5 I'd installed personally, the ones that fed to a separate server she'd never discovered. I'd watched the footage after the feds kicked in my door. Watched her and Sebastian Knox on my couch, in my bed, drinking my whiskey while they planned my destruction. Watched her laugh, actually laugh, as Sebastian outlined how they'd frame me, seize my assets, and split my empire between them. He'll never see it coming, Sebastian had said, his arm around my wife's shoulders. Min-jae's weakness has always been loyalty. He trusts the people he loves. Tiana had smiled, That same smile she'd given me 1,000 times over 5 years of marriage. That's why this will work. He loves me too much to suspect. The transport van waited outside, engine running, exhaust rising in the cold afternoon air. 2 U.S. Marshals flanked the door, hands on their sidearms like I might try to run. I wouldn't run. Running was for men who were beaten. As they loaded me into the van, I caught a glimpse of Tiana emerging from the courthouse. Sebastian was there, keeping a careful distance for the cameras. But I saw the way his hand brushed against hers. Quick, possessive. The van door slammed shut, cutting off the view. 15 years. That's what they thought they'd bought. 15 years of freedom while I rotted in a cell. 15 years to strip my empire clean, to spend my money, to sleep in my bed, to live the life they'd stolen. They'd made one critical mistake, that they'd left me breathing. The van pulled away from the courthouse, heading toward the federal facility that would be my home for the next decade and a half. Or so everyone believed. My reflection stared back at me from the dark window, still in the suit Tiana had picked out for me that morning. You should look respectable for the judge, Min-jae. The tie she'd straightened with trembling fingers and worried eyes. Such careful theater. But in the bulletproof glass of that prison van, with my hands cuffed and my empire burning, I smiled for the first time in weeks. Because they thought the trial was over. They thought the war was won. They thought Kang Min-jae was finished. They were wrong. Dead men make the best ghosts, and I was about to haunt every single one of them. The heavy iron gates of Blackwood Penitentiary didn't just close. They groaned with the weight of every soul buried inside. I felt the vibration in my marrow, a low frequency that signaled the death of Kang Min-jae, the tycoon, and the birth of inmate 9924. The processing room was a fluorescent-lit purgatory smelling of industrial bleach and unwashed fear. I stood naked, my skin a map of ink and scars, while a guard with a bored expression and a rusted soul searched me. He lingered on the tattoos, the dragon trailing down my neck, the intricate black work covering my chest, the protective sigils on my hands. In the outside world, these were marks of a king. Here they were just targets. Everything in the bag. 9924, he barked. I dropped my life into a plastic bin. My Tom Ford suit, the silk tie Tiana had straightened only hours before the betrayal, and my wedding ring. The gold band hit the bottom of the bin with a hollow clink. I didn't look back at it. To look back was to acknowledge the wound, and in Blackwood, blood only invited sharks. By the time the sun set behind the jagged concrete horizon, I was locked in a 6-by-9-foot box. The air was stagnant, tasting of recycled breath and limestone. From the tier below, the symphony of hell began. The rhythmic banging of cups against bars, the feral shouts of men who had forgotten the sound of their own names, and the predatory whispers that drifted through the ventilation shafts. New meat! A voice rasped from the shadows of the neighboring cell. Korean royalty, I heard you're worth a lot of favors, Kang. Or should I say, you were. I sat on the edge of the thin, plastic-covered mattress, my back straight, my tattooed hands resting calmly on my knees. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. I spent the hours cataloging the sounds. The interval of the guards' rounds, the specific metallic pitch of the different cell locks, and the heavy, measured footsteps of the man 3 doors down who didn't join in the shouting. Around midnight, a shadow flickered past my bars, a runner, using a weighted string to pass contraband. He paused, his eyes narrowing as they landed on my ink. He spat toward my shoes. Enjoy the quiet, boss. It won't last till breakfast. I stood up, moving with a predatory grace that made him flinch. I reached into the waistband of my orange scrubs, pulling out a crumpled pack of high-grade cigarettes I'd secured from a transport guard during the intake chaos. I slid 2 through the bars. I don't want quiet, I said, my voice like grinding stones. I want to know who runs the kitchen, who handles the mail, and which guard has a gambling debt. Tell me, and the rest of the pack is yours. The runner's greed flickered in the dark. He took the cigarettes. At that moment, the cell ceased to be a cage. It became my new war room. They thought they had buried me, but they had simply given me a new foundation to build upon. Dead men make the best ghosts, and ghosts see everything. By the third week, the concrete walls of Blackwood had stopped being a cage and started becoming a map. Power here didn't flow through bank accounts or boardrooms. It moved in the shadow of the gym bleachers and the steam of the industrial laundry. I watched the tides of the yard, my tattooed hands tucked into my pockets, absorbing the hierarchy of the condemned. At the center of it all was Merrick Reed, a mountain of a man with a chest full of ink and eyes that had seen too much sunless sky. Our first meeting was a collision of two different kinds of gravity. We met near the weight piles, the air thick with the scent of rusted iron and sweat. Merrick's crew fanned out, a wall of muscle designed to intimidate. "This is my yard, Kong," Merrick growled, his voice a low vibration that matched the scars on his knuckles. "I don't care what you were on the outside. In here, you're just another mouth to feed. You want a seat at the table, you pay the tax." I didn't flinch. I let my gaze drift past him to the group of Aryan Brotherhood members circling a younger inmate from Merrick's crew. The tension was a few seconds away from a riot that would bring the guards down with batons and pepper spray. "You're about to lose 3 of your best earners in a retaliatory strike over a stolen shipment of nicotine," I said, my voice cutting through the heat like a blade. "Violence is a messy currency, Merrick. It depreciates. If you want the Brotherhood to back off, tell their leader that the warden's new random cell searches are being triggered by an anonymous tip about their hidden stash in the boiler room. Tell him I'm the only one who can stop the next tip." Merrick froze, his eyes narrowing as he processed the move. I wasn't fighting for his territory. I was managing it. By the next morning, the yard was silent. The conflict had vanished, replaced by a wary, newfound respect. Merrick didn't shake my hand. Trust was too expensive for that, but he stepped aside when I walked past. I was no longer a target. I was an asset. With the internal borders secured, I reached for the outside world. Through a coded message slipped into a legal brief, I reestablished contact with Dominic Cole. His reply came 2 days later, hidden in the margins of a newspaper. The news was a cold drench of reality. Sebastian and Tiana hadn't just taken the throne. They were dismantling the kingdom. My shell accounts were being drained. My loyalists were being hunted, and the penthouse, the place where Tiana had once whispered promises of forever, was now the headquarters for their new, hollow empire. They were celebrating their victory, convinced I was rotting in silence. They didn't realize that from this cell, I was finally seeing the board clearly. Every dollar they stole was just a piece of bait I'd let them take. The ghost was starting to haunt his own house. By the 6th month, the rhythm of prison life had become the background noise to a much larger symphony of destruction. Merrick Reed was no longer just an ally. He was the iron fist inside the velvet glove of my cell. While the guards saw a disgraced boss rotting in silence, Merrick's network of runners and cleaners became my eyes and ears. Through him, I controlled the flow of information, ensuring that the right whispers reached the right ears, and the wrong ones were silenced before they could leave the yard. Communication with Dominic Cole became a steady, cold stream of intelligence hidden within the banal text of legal correspondence. Every week, the reports grew more poisonous. Sebastian Knox hadn't just moved into my penthouse. He was occupying my life. Dominic's photos, encoded into digital metadata, showed Tiana standing on the balcony I once owned, draped in the jewelry I had bought her, with Sebastian's hand resting possessively on the small of her back. They looked like royalty. They looked like they had forgotten that empires built on blood require a foundation of absolute trust, something neither of them possessed. But the most useful piece of intelligence was the fracture forming between the traitors. Shin Sumin, the man who had traded a decade of brotherhood for a seat at a table that was now being pulled away from him, was being marginalized. Sebastian, ever the elite parasite, was tightening the purse strings. It was time to pull the first thread. I directed Dominic to plant a ledger in one of Shin's private safe houses. A meticulous forgery that appeared to show Sebastian was skimming nearly 30% of the offshore profits into a private account Tiana didn't know about. I didn't need to attack them. I just needed to let their own greed do the work. A week later, the feedback reached my cell. Shin had been spotted at a local bar, drinking heavily and speaking in hushed, angry tones to his remaining loyalists. In the penthouse, the air had turned arctic. Tiana had started questioning the accounting, her sharp eyes following Sebastian with a new, flickering suspicion. I sat on my bunk, my tattooed hands steady as I watched the moonlight crawl across the concrete floor. The alliance that had put me here was a house of cards, and I had just blown the first gust of wind. They thought the walls of Blackwood kept me in. They didn't realize these walls were the only thing keeping them safe from me. For now, the ghost was just watching. But soon, the haunting would begin in earnest. The year mark approached with the slow, crushing inevitability of a glacier. But beneath the frozen surface of my silence, the cracks were widening into canyons. In the penthouse, the air didn't just feel cold. It felt lethal. Through Dominic, I watched the psychological rot take hold. The first explosion came when Sebastian, fueled by the forged ledgers I'd planted, publicly accused Shin Sumin of siphoning funds to build his own shadow organization. The accusation was a jagged blade twisted in an old wound. Shin, who had sacrificed his honor for a brotherhood that no longer existed, didn't recoil. He hardened. The trust that had been the bedrock of their coup was now a slurry of suspicion. While they fought over the money, I went for the heart. I directed Dominic to slip a series of high-resolution photos into Tiana's private cloud. Images of Sebastian meeting with a woman from a rival syndicate in a darkened corner of a hotel lounge. It didn't matter that the meeting was a setup, or that the affair was a ghost of Dominic's creation. To a woman like Tiana, who had traded her soul for security, infidelity wasn't just a betrayal of the bed. It was a threat to her survival. To ensure the chaos was absolute, I played my most aggressive card yet. I leaked the coordinates of Sebastian's most valuable narcotics shipment, the one intended to stabilize their plummeting accounts, to a hungry Russian crew. The interception was a massacre. Sebastian lost $30 million in a single hour, and with it, the last shred of his credibility. The desperation reached the walls of Blackwood faster than I expected. One Tuesday, during the chaos of the midday yard, the air shifted. I felt the familiar prickle of a threat before I saw the gleam of the shiv. A man I didn't recognize, likely paid with the last of Sebastian's desperate silver, lunged from the shadow of the gym wall. He never reached me. Merrick Reed moved like a mountain in a landslide. Before the blade could graze my uniform, Merrick's hand closed around the assassin's wrist with a sickening snap. He didn't just stop the man. He dismantled him, leaving the would-be killer in a heap on the gravel while the other inmates looked away. Merrick wiped a drop of blood from his cheek and looked at me, his expression unreadable. "They're getting loud on the outside, Kong. Means you're winning." I looked at my tattooed hands, steady and cold. The empire was fracturing, and the people who thought they had buried me were now the ones gasping for air. I wasn't just a ghost anymore. I was the architect of their haunting, and the walls of my cage were the only thing keeping them from seeing the monster they had created. The seeds had grown into a forest of thorns, and soon, I would invite them all into the woods. The visiting room smelled of floor wax and the metallic tang of despair, a stark contrast to the scent of Crete Aventus and expensive gin that usually trailed in Tiana's wake. When she appeared behind the reinforced glass, she looked like an apparition from a world that had forgotten I existed. She wore a tailored white wool coat, the color of innocence she'd long ago traded away, and her expression was a curated mask of pity. I sat down, my prison orange a jarring stain against the cold blue-gray light of the room. I didn't pick up the phone. I simply watched her, my tattooed hands flat on the cold metal table, my neck ink stark and menacing in the dim light. Tiana finally grabbed the receiver, a smug, diamond-bright smile tugging at the corners of her lips. I followed suit, the plastic cold against my ear. "You look thin, Jay," she purred, her intelligent eyes scanning my cell-worn face for a sign of breaking. "The penthouse feels much larger without your shadow looming over it. Sebastian and we've made some changes. It's finally a home." She had come to perform the final rites, to twist the knife she'd buried in my back a year ago. I let her speak, let her describe the parties, the new alliances, and the way my empire was being polished into something she could call her own. "Are you finished?" I asked, my voice a low, gravelly vibration. Her smile flickered. "I thought you'd have more to say. Rage, perhaps? A plea for mercy?" "I don't waste breath on the dead, Tiana," I said, leaning closer until my breath fogged the glass. "You think you're the queen, but you're just a placeholder. Does Sebastian still take his calls in the second bedroom? The ones where he's negotiating the sale of the shell accounts you think are your retirement? Does he still tell you he loves you before he checks the tracking device he's hidden in your favorite Hermes bag?" The blood drained from her face, leaving her dark skin looking ashen. "You're lying. You're a caged dog barking at ghosts. Ask him about the accounts in the Cayman Islands," I whispered, my dark eyes boring into hers with a predatory focus that made her flinch. "The ones in his name only. Ask him why he's meeting with the Russian syndicate without you. He didn't betray me because he wanted a life with you, Tiana. He betrayed me because you were the easiest way to the keys. Now that he has them, you're just a witness he hasn't dealt with yet." I hung up the phone. Tiana sat frozen, her hand still trembling against the glass. The gloating mask had shattered, replaced by the raw, jagged edges of the same paranoia I had spent months cultivating. She stood up, her movements jerky and uncoordinated, and fled the room without looking back. I watched her go, a ghost of a smile touching my lips. The prey had finally realized they were being hunted, and the most dangerous place for Tiana to be wasn't in this prison with me. It was at home with the man she'd chosen. The turn had begun. The silence of the penthouse had become a weapon. Tiana moved through the rooms like a ghost in her own life, her intelligent eyes scanning every shadow for the betrayals I had promised her. She didn't have to look far. Following the breadcrumbs Dominic had left, she bypassed Sebastian's security and found the hidden accounts, the ones that proved he was preparing to vanish with the spoils of our life while leaving her to face the fallout. The home she had boasted about was a gilded cage, and the man beside her was the jailer. Sebastian, meanwhile, was drowning. He wasn't a king. He was a bookkeeper who had stolen a crown he didn't know how to wear. The intercepted shipments and the sudden drain on his liquidity had him pacing the marble floors until dawn. He knew he was being dismantled, piece by piece, but he couldn't see the hand holding the scalpel. He accused the Russians, the Italians, and finally, his own lieutenants, his paranoia turning the organization into a snake eating its own tail. In the midst of this unraveling, Shin Sumin finally broke. Sidelined and fearing a bullet from Sebastian's increasingly erratic hand, he sought a life raft. He met Dominic Cole in the back of a rain-slicked parking garage, unaware that the man offering him a way out was the same man who had built his trap. Shin gave up everything, dates, names, and the location of the fabricated evidence used to bury me. He thought he was buying his freedom. He was actually signing his confession. Inside Blackwood, the air began to shift. The crushing weight of the 15-year sentence started to lift as Dominic's legal team, armed with Shin's quiet admissions and newly discovered procedural violations, filed a massive appeal. The original trial hadn't just been a mistake. It had been a circus of evidence tampering. I sat in the yard, watching a storm brew over the concrete walls. Merrick stood a few feet away, his presence a silent barrier between me and the rest of the world. "The paperwork hit the courthouse an hour ago," he muttered, his eyes on the guard tower. The gates are starting to rust, Jay. I looked at my hands, the ink on my knuckles sharp against my pale skin. The empire was no longer just fracturing. It was screaming as it tore apart. Tiana was terrified, Sebastian was blind with rage, and the legal system that had been used to seal my coffin was now being used to prying it open. They had forgotten that when you bury a man alive, you give him nothing to do but plan his return. And my return was no longer a dream, it was a court date. The 18th month arrived with the sudden, sharp crack of a gavel. This time, it was the sound of my cage splintering. The news of the granted appeal hit Blackwood like a shockwave, the court's acknowledgement of evidence tampering acting as a formal declaration of war. My conviction hadn't just been questioned. It was being erased, and with it, the only wall of safety the traitors had left. In the penthouse, Sebastian Knox didn't just panic. He dissolved. Desperation has a specific scent. A foul musk that clings to a man when he realizes his cleverness has run out. Knowing that my release was no longer a matter of if but when, he reached into his dwindling pockets to buy the only thing he had left, a final, desperate assassination attempt. The hit came during the late-night shift change, when the shadows in the cell block were at their longest. 2 inmates, ghosts of men promised a debt forgiveness they'd never live to collect, moved toward my bars with sharpened steel. They expected a sleeping man. They found a wolf. Merrick Reed's crew didn't just stop them. They turned the corridor into a slaughterhouse. It was over in seconds. A flurry of muffled grunts and the wet thud of bone hitting concrete. Merrick stepped into the dim pool of light outside my cell, his chest tattoos glistening with sweat. He didn't say a word, but he handed the guards the attackers' burner phones, each one filled with encrypted messages tracing back to Sebastian's shadow accounts. By morning, the very attempt on my life became the final nail in their legal coffin. Proof of a conspiracy that reached from the penthouse to the cell block. While Sebastian scrambled to hide the blood on his hands, Tiana chose flight. She had always been the smartest of the 3, knowing when a ship was too heavy with holes to stay afloat. She tried to vanish into the velvet dark of the night, headed for the private terminals at O'Hare with a suitcase full of untraceable bonds and a heart full of terror. She never made it past the security gate. Dominic Cole was waiting in the shadows of the VIP lounge, his tattooed right hand visible as he held up a phone displaying her frozen bank accounts. He didn't need to use force. The sight of him was a promise of what was coming. Tiana stood paralyzed, the cold realization hitting her that there was no corner of the world far enough to escape the reach of a man she tried to bury. Inside my cell, I sat in the absolute stillness of the dark. My appeal was signed. My enemies were exposed. The gates were ready to open. I wasn't just coming home. I was coming for the throne they'd bled dry. The haunting was over. The reckoning had begun. The iron gates of Blackwood Penitentiary hissed open at 11 p.m., a legal technicality acting as the key to my resurrection. I stepped into the frigid night air, not as a reformed man, but as a ghost returning to haunt his own house. I didn't wait for a limousine. I stepped into a nondescript black sedan driven by Dominic Cole. No words were exchanged. He handed me a heavy, cold handgun and a folder of final locations. The 18-month wait was over. The night was for blood. Our first stop was a dimly lit warehouse on the edge of the district. Shin Soo-min sat tied to a chair, the bravado he'd used to testify against me stripped away, leaving only a trembling shell. I walked into the light, my tattooed hands steady as I looked into the eyes of the man who had called me brother. I didn't scream. I didn't even raise my voice. "You thought the seat was yours, Shin?" I said, the sound of my voice making him flinch as if I'd struck him. "But you were just the dog they used to bite the hand that fed you." I leaned in, my neck tattoos stark against the harsh overhead bulb. "You have 60 seconds to choose. A plane ticket to a country where no one knows your name or a permanent spot under this concrete. If you ever touch Korean soil again, I won't be the one talking." Shin chose exile, sobbing as Dominic dragged him toward the door. He was a coward, and death was too dignified a gift for him. By midnight, I was ascending the private elevator to the penthouse. The air inside was thick with the scent of expensive scotch and the lingering decay of a failing coup. Sebastian Knox was at my desk, frantically shredding documents, his face pale and slick with sweat. He looked up, and for a moment he forgot how to breathe. "Min Jae," he choked out, reaching for a drawer. I fired once. The bullet shattered his hand before he could touch his weapon. I walked around the desk, the rhythmic tap of my shoes echoing like a funeral march. I forced him to look at the screen of his own laptop, where Dominic had just finished wiping every cent from his offshore accounts. "You destroyed an empire for money you'll never spend, Sebastian." I didn't let him beg. I ended the betrayal with a single, clinical shot that silenced the office forever. Tiana was in the master bedroom, her bags packed, her eyes wide with a terror that finally looked genuine. I didn't raise my gun to her. I did something much worse. I showed her the legal documents Dominic had filed, evidence of her embezzlement, her conspiracy, and her involvement in Sebastian's illegal trades. "I'm not going to kill you, Tiana," I whispered, the cold blue-gray light of the city silhouetting my ink-stained frame. "I'm going to let you live in the world you created. No money, no status, no name. Every door in this city is closed to you. You wanted to be free of me. Now you're free of everything." I walked out as the sirens began to wail in the distance, leaving her screaming into the hollow silence of a penthouse that no longer belonged to anyone. The night of reckoning was over. The king had returned to a kingdom of ashes. The penthouse windows offered a panoramic view of a city that once again bowed to my name, but the air inside was different now. Sterile, quiet, and devoid of the perfume of lies. 6 months had passed since the night of the reckoning, and the Kong Empire had been rebuilt not on the shifting sands of loyalty, but on the cold, hard bedrock of absolute fear. Merrick Reed moved through the hallways like a silent sentinel, his presence a reminder that power was best guarded by those who had survived the dark. He and Dominic Cole ran the operations with a clinical, bloodless efficiency. There were no more inner circles, no more whispered confidences over dinner. There were only directives and consequences. I had restructured everything to ensure that no single man, and certainly no woman, held enough pieces of the puzzle to complete a picture of my downfall. Dominic entered the study, his tattooed hand resting on a silver tray. He set a single envelope down before me. "A report from the private investigators in the Midwest," he said shortly. "Regarding her." I didn't need to open it. I already knew what the grainy photos would show. Tiana, once draped in silk and diamonds, now wearing a stained waitress uniform in a town that didn't even appear on most maps. I knew she lived in a studio apartment that smelled of cheap tobacco and regret, earning just enough to remind her of everything she had lost. She was alive, but in the world of the Kong Empire, she was a ghost haunting a life that had moved on without her. I picked up the envelope. For a second, the phantom weight of a wedding ring itched against my finger, a muscle memory of a man who no longer existed. Then, I held the corner of the paper to the flame of my lighter. I watched the fire consume the evidence of her misery, the black ash fluttering into the crystal tray like the wings of a dead moth. I didn't read a single word. I walked to the floor-to-ceiling glass, my reflection staring back at me. The tattoos on my neck and hands seemed darker against the sharp lines of my charcoal suit, a permanent armor against a world that had tried to bury me. I had won. My accounts were overflowing. My enemies were either in the ground or in exile, and my throne was more secure than it had ever been. But as I looked out over the glittering throne of lights that was Chicago, the victory tasted like the gray limestone of a prison cell. I was the king of a kingdom of ashes, powerful beyond measure, but utterly, irrevocably alone. I had learned the final, brutal lesson of the climb. Trust was a luxury for the weak, and love was a vulnerability that invited the blade. I turned away from the view and sat back down at my desk, the shadows of the room swallowing me whole. I was a man who had traded his soul for a crown, and as the city slept beneath me, I realized that the only thing more terrifying than losing everything was finally having it all and realizing there was no one left to tell. In the silence of the penthouse, the king ruled, and the king was cold.